This is the Law 401 podcast, legal issues decoded for you, brought to you by Roger Williams University School of Law.
Welcome back to Law 401, legal issues decoded for you, brought to you by Roger Williams University School of Law. I'm Michael Donnelly Boylan, and you are?
I'm Nicole, and I'm one of the co-hosts, and we're here to talk about legal issues decoded. We're going to cut down some of the legal noise and make law more accessible, and I'm really excited about our guest today.
Yeah, and so I'm one of the associate deans at the law school, and I am not an attorney, nor am I from Rhode Island, so I'm the imposter. And Nicole, who are you?
I am an attorney. I am also a law librarian and a law professor. Now I'm a podcast host, and I live in Rhode Island.
Well, let's get into it. I'm super excited about this particular episode. It is one of those full circle moments for me. I served as dean of admissions at the law school for 22 years. And one of the few applications that still moves me today was Weayonnoh Nelson-Davies' application. And it was so clear at that time she was going to become a leader. And to have her join me as a leader today is just one of those really powerful moments in my career. So I'm super excited to welcome Weayonnoh Nelson-Davies, the executive director of the Economic Progress Institute.
I'm really excited to be here too. As an alum of the law school and having this podcast, I was jumping for joy that you all are putting this together.
So, Weayonnoh, tell us about your background.
So, Michael said I'm the executive director of the Economic Progress Institute. I am a Liberian-American Civil War survivor who have lived in Rhode Island for almost 30 years now. So I think I can claim being a Rhode Islander.
You can.
Great. And I'm also an attorney. And I practiced before coming to EPI for about 14 years as a staff attorney and then managing attorney for legal aid firms in Massachusetts. And did a little bit of everything from housing to family law, immigration, public benefits, guardianship, special education. And then I didn't stop there, also focused on the effects of structural racism on poverty and led medical legal partnership work. So coming to EPI, it felt like a full circle movement for me where we do a little bit of everything when it comes to racial and economic justice issues.
So we've asked you to come on the podcast today to talk about the president's so-called Big Beautiful Bill and its effect here in the state of Rhode Island. So let's get into this. Nicole.
Sure. So some people are not following federal policy closely. Some people are scared. Some people are busy. And some people are choosing not to listen to the news because it's big, it's noisy, it's important. But can you explain what the One Big Beautiful Bill is and what's in it?
Yes. So this One Big Beautiful Bill, and it has many names. You'll hear it called OBBB. You will hear it be called HR1. And in my world that deals with progressive policies, you will hear it called the Big Ugly Bill, the Big Horrendous Bill. So depending on who you're talking to, you may get many names. But what this bill is, or now law, because it was passed by President Trump on January 4th, is a sweeping federal package. So that's one thing. Sweeping means it really touches on a lot of different issues, big issues that impact people's lives. The other piece of this bill is it was created through what we call a budget resolution and reconciliation process. And that is important because this process allows a very partisan, fast track ability to move big things. And so this reconciliation process allowed Congress, because it was a one-party majority and the White House as a one-party leadership, to move the president's agenda. And so the president's agenda at the beginning of the year were a few things. One, tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, and two, funding for immigration enforcement, deportations, detention, border war. And so this Big Ugly or Beautiful Bill was a way to get tax and spending done in a fast way that you do not need a supermajority in the Senate that you normally need for big bills. So instead of 60 senators, you only needed 51 senators to get this passed through.
So as I listen to the news, there's all these numbers being thrown around, billions and billions in cuts in Medicaid and SNAP. Can you talk to how that affects the average everyday Rhode Islander?
Yes. And one of the things about this is it really impacts states, and it's going to impact Rhode Islanders living in the state. So a couple of things that are in the bill, cuts to Medicaid and SNAPs, a big one. And there were cuts to pay for tax cuts to the wealthy. So Rhode Island, so I'm going to break down a little bit for people, Medicaid numbers and who's going to be impacted by that, and SNAP numbers and who are going to be impacted by that, because those are the two big entitlement programs in this bill. So for Medicaid...
Wait, I'm sorry. Before we get too far, part of what we try to do is make sure that everyone is sort of understands what you're saying. What do you mean when you use the word entitlement in a legal context?
Right. So it doesn't mean that I am entitled, I walk in and be like, give me SNAP and I get it. That is not what entitlement means. Under the law, entitlement programs are programs that are in the law. And if you are eligible for it, because there's a lot of criteria, then you're entitled to get it. So if I apply for SNAP and I meet the financial eligibility requirements, I meet the household composition or immigration status, and everything checks off, I'm entitled to get that. So that's what entitlement programs mean. So SNAP and Medicaid are one of those where if you're eligible, you can get under the law.
Thanks.
So you've written a lot about Medicaid. Can you explain to our audience basically what Medicaid does and how these changes are going to affect it?
Right. So I'll definitely touch on Medicaid and SNAP and how it impact Rhode Islanders. So Medicaid is our state program or federal program. Every state have a Medicaid program with different names that provide affordable care, health care to people. So in Rhode Island, under the OBBB, our Medicaid program serve over 311,000 Rhode Islanders. So that's about 1 in 3 Rhode Islanders have Medicaid, which means they cannot afford health insurance and need that. So what this bill is doing, there are a couple of things. Under that, there are a few groups of Rhode Islanders that are going to be more impacted than others. So, and when the Affordable Care Act passed under the Obama administration, we expanded Medicaid in certain states. Rhode Island was one of those expansion states. And we expanded Medicaid to allow people that made more than 100% of the federal poverty level, which is the standard we use to determine if you're eligible. We increased that to 138%. And we allow adults without dependents to get on Medicaid. And this recently happened. So under the OBBB, about 82,000 of the expansion groups are now at risk of losing their Medicaid. And why? Because for the first time, we have what we call work requirements. Some entitlement programs have work requirements where you have to either work or do community service to keep your benefits. That have never been a thing for Medicaid. Under this bill, that expansion group will be required. It's being called community engagement requirements, but they're going to be required to work at least 80 hours or do community service to stay on Medicaid. So that's a big number for us to watch in Rhode Island. What are we going to do and how are we going to help those 82,000? The other group under this Medicaid are immigrant groups. So under Medicaid before, legal permanent residents, asylees, those who escape persecution in their homes, refugees were able to get Medicaid. Under this bill, asylees, refugees, domestic violence victims are no longer eligible with their immigration status to get Medicaid. So there's about 12,000 folks who are in that group that could be at risk of losing it, and that's just Medicaid.
Can I just... Of course. The things you said very succinctly and knowledgeably and matter-of-factly really desperately impact actual human beings. And when I'm hearing you talk about some of these people, 12,000, I think around is what you said, are people who were refugees from other countries. So they were not safely living in another country and then came here because we expressed this sort of ideals of being this like one United States and the home of the brave, the land of the free. And then they come here and there is no way for them to get back up on their feet. And I'm not suggesting, I'm not an expert in refugees, asylees, any of that. Just as a human being, if you've been through this tremendous trauma and you find a magical way to get somewhere safe, you know, maybe it makes more sense that there's like some time where you're able to restart your life and take care of your kids and go see doctors and whatever. And so I just want to point out that the things you said were very fact-based, but the job you have is actually very human-based.
Exactly.
And it's really hard. There's like it's hard to hear that. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, no, it impacts, I mean, these Medicaid cuts impact my own family. So it's real. These are real people losing their health insurance.
Yeah, and it's people for sure. And then, like you said, like victim of domestic violence, for example, victim of trafficking. These are people that are escaping, right? And so safety net in our country, in our democracy, in a country that have, welcome immigrants before is a change in how we're doing democracy and how we're caring for people. And so there's deep concerns, but there's also financial concerns, because some people have interest in fiscal pieces of it. So our state, Rhode Island, our Medicaid budget is about $4 billion. $2.5 billion come from the federal government. We spent about, when I talk about that expansion group, we spent over $800 million on providing Medicaid for that expansion group. So now, not only is this bill happening in Rhode Island, we have to decide, are we going to care for those humans, or are we going to make decisions because our budget can't handle it? So there's going to be deep implications for us as a state.
Before we transition away from the basics, my librarian brain wants to ask you a fundamental question. And I also want to sort of understand everyone to have a sense of what this is actually like. So I read somewhere that the one big beautiful bill was 870 pages. How do you sit and read 870 pages with the level of nuance you would need to understand that you're cutting programs or cutting money from programs or adding these restrictions to impact people's lives? And so I hear 870 pages, and then the one big beautiful bill is something like $3 trillion. How do the people who are making these decisions, they have a lot of help? Do they have time to read 870 pages? You work with legislators all the time.
Right.
How does this work?
Yeah. And then before I say that, I do want to mention SNAP cuts too, because that's really important. People focus on Medicaid, but SNAP is really important as well. In Rhode Island, 144,000 people are on SNAP. 35,000 of them are at risk with the new implications of SNAP. And that, again, the immigrant group, those who use utility allowance. Now you can only be elder and disabled. Rhode Island as a state is going to have to deal with about $73 million cut. So that was also in this 870 pages bill. To your question, there are a couple of concerns about it. Most budgets are very large, are very dense. A lot of people do not read that, including people who are elected to read them. So that's a problem across the board. Then when you have a big spending bill like this, you need a longer process for people to go through. The reconciliation process made it very short and very fast-tracked. I sounded the alarm. I did a op-ed in February because we already knew when they were giving instructions to committee that there were instructions to cut Medicaid and SNAP in the bill. There were some legislators that were ready to vote that were like, no, there's no cuts to Medicaid and SNAP in this bill. But whether they either read it or were being disingenuous, we're not sure. But that was what was in this bill. So that was one of the pushback to saying there's too much in it. We're cutting major programs. We need time for people to go through this bill. So what normally happens when you have a big bill, whether it's Congress or Rhode Island state legislator, you have budget committees. So their job is to go through the bill and look through it. You have advocates and think tanks like EPI I have some people on staff that get excited when the budget is coming up. I have my director of research and fiscal policy. He's like, I'm prepared to stay up all night and go through this budget. So you have people who love big bills and big budgets to go through.
That would be Nicole. That would be Nicole.
Yeah, so you have people who do that like Nicole and Alan who will go through this. But then you have committees go through it, and then you have think tanks also break down the major parts. And that's what we did. We were able to look and be like, we know there are a lot of things in it, and some of it is distracting. There's line items, but there's big things like Medicaid cut, SNAP cuts, tax cuts to the wealthy, immigration, like those were big ticket items that people will hone in. We gave talking points. Other people will give talking points. So legislators will be like, here's a one pager on what the main issues are. And that's how they get through it. But not having a process for public comments, which is important, that was concerning because the public didn't have a chance to look through it. But that is what you need to really dive into such a large legislation like this one.
And honestly, they had already read Project 2025 and the blueprint had been laid beforehand.
Correct. But they denied that these things were going to be in a bill.
So from a legal perspective, how is Congress able to make cuts of this size to programs like people really depend on? How does that work? Yeah,
it's back to the it's back to a couple of things. The way our democracy is set up, they shouldn't be able to without people and voters having an input, right? And there was a process where voters started. Once we realized what was happening, there were town halls across the country where people pushed back on. But we have this reconciliation process that is interesting, depending on what side of the aisle you are. And, in all fairness, President Trump and this Congress were not the only ones that have used this process. We've used this process for the Inflation Reduction Act under Biden. We've used this project to push through a lot of other healthcare bills in the past when one party and the White House are unaligned. But the way they were able to do it this time, again, they had instructions from the president. They believed they had a mandate from voters to make sure they passed through President Trump's agenda. And so you have this process that say, we don't need 60 senators. So if we have just one additional senator, which we have now, we can actually push through what we want. And again, thinking of our democracy, bipartisanship is important for our democracy. This type of progress shuts out the other party. So there is no pushback. There's no negotiation. It's one party deciding we're going to do this. And no matter what you say, it doesn't matter because we have the votes. And so having the votes allow them to really put us in a $4.5 trillion debt and impact low-income communities, immigrants, in a way that shouldn't happen in our democracy. But unfortunately, we have a process that allows it.
And I think that's one of the most important points here for the audience to understand, because so many of us grew up on Schoolhouse Rock, right? And we have this idealized version of civics and how a bill passes. But both parties have been party to pushing through bills and setting precedent that is not what the founders of the country intended and passed bills like this. So how does this work? If Congress can just change the rules at any time when you're on these services, what does that actually mean for the average Rhode Islander who has to plan for their life?
Right. A couple of things. I go back to voting, and next year, 2026, is an election year, is really important. If you know a party does not want people on Medicaid, does not want people on SNAP, want to punish states that have expanded these programs, as a voter, it is your duty and your rights and responsibility to vote who you think will be in the interest of your state or your community. So that's one thing. The other thing is really having residents engaged in knowing what was happening. Again, a few people, EPI, we started sounding the alarm in January, February, saying there's a process happening that will cut it. And so people being engaged and really pushing back, not only in Rhode Island, where we had a congressional delegation, we knew was going to vote against it, but reaching out to families in other states to be like, talk to your representatives that this is not good for us, right? So that's a way to be engaged. I think the other way is really on the state level. Another thing we tried to do was we knew it was coming and a lot of the cost was going to be shifted to the states to figure this out. And so it's being proactive. So there's not much we can control in Congress right now. But again, next year is election year. Congress can change. When Congress changes, law changes. So maybe that's a good thing for our democracy where you're not stuck permanently in certain places. But state leaders can also start planning proactively to say, what do we need to do to protect Rhode Islanders, right? And then I think the final part is, again, sort of thinking about what do we need to do to protect certain programs? So as you will notice, Social Security was not brought up in this reconciliation process. Why? There's a law that protects Social Security from a recreation simple majority process. So again, thinking about, do we need deep permanent protections for something like Medicaid that impacts so many people's lives. There's an opportunity to have a law that could protect it in the future.
Yeah. I think one of the most beautiful things about our system is the fact that it flushes itself out every 2 years.
Right.
Like every 2 years, you have the ability to either make a change in the presidency or sort of redirect the president by changing the House of Representatives or the Senate. And so I think it's really important that people understand that if this is not something that they agree with, there's ways to use their voice as you so eloquently do all the time.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit more about the op-ed you wrote, which we will have in our show notes. You wrote that civil rights and democracy are on the line. Can you talk a little bit about how you sort of put all this together? The things that are happening on the federal level, the impacts it will have on states, the way in which this impacts democracy.
I think there are a couple of things happening. And to Michael's point, having elections is really important and it helps protect us. However, there are certain changes that impact people's lives today. And there are certain rollbacks that are really hard to get back from. So that's the scary part from my perspective of what's happening in 2025. So you have the one big beautiful bill. That was one thing that was happening. At the time I wrote the op-ed, a lot of people were really focused on that. They were focused on the executive orders that were coming every week, right? So you had executive orders saying DEI needs to be dead, right? So what was illegal DEI? People needed to stop doing DEI. You have federal freezes where nonprofits that have had appropriations from Congress and had contracts, they were being cut. So now you had people who couldn't serve the communities that they were committed to serving. You had federal employees being laid out. You had certain agencies that were there to protect civil rights and pull data being eliminated. So all of these things were happening all at once. And then you had this little sneaky reconciliation process happening. And so when I sat back, I looked at the implications of what these could do within the 2 years we had before an opportunity for Congress to change, and recognized that we were really pulling back years and decades of civil rights protections that made sure that if your race would not determine that you're being discriminated against, and it was blatant that your race was going to be used against you, especially if you're Black or Latino or Asian or Native Americans. And so I was seeing all of this happening, and from my perspective as well, I'm a civil war survivor. I grew up at a time as a child where I saw democracy crumble right before my eye, and that destruction is hard to get back from. You are having people lose their job. Medicaid is needed for people to live. You could die without health insurance in this country. So even though some people were, we can wait until 2026, to me, I was like, no, we can't wait until 2026 because we need to make sure once we have citizens thinking this is normal, our ability to act, our courage to want to push back sort of dwindle. And then you have a risk of democracy when people are not engaged anymore, when people think whatever they do not matter, because big things like this happen whether they want it or not. And so it was really important for me to say, hold up, something's happening to our democracy that doesn't sit right. It's going to impact so many people. It's going to destroy who we are as a nation. And we need to start doing something on the state, on the local, and on the federal level to say, no matter what party you're for, it's important that we commit to protecting democracy for all.
Before you get to the next question, I just wanted to reflect on, as we talk about voting, there's also the challenges to redistricting. There's a whole bunch of other sort of litigation that's happening outside of Rhode Island over there, which can impact the way in which people's voice is heard. Also, part of democracy working is that the electorate has faith in that democracy, not necessarily faith in a particular person that gets elected, but faith that the system itself will work out. And I think one of the themes that I got from what you said is that faith is being eroded, and because that democracy is being eroded. And then sort of the last thing I got from your comments was you have been there, done that, and that's a different voice than maybe a lot of other people have in Rhode Island, and that's worth listening to.
Yeah, as someone who's actually witnessed democracy crumble in Liberia, you bring such an interesting perspective to this, and understanding of how things like simple cuts to SNAP, which seem simple to some people, or dismantling the Department of Education, and how all of those little decisions actually affect our broader democracy and our just policy decisions. So thank you for that. You've cited that tens of thousands of Rhode Islanders could lose coverage for food assistance. What does that actually look like on the ground for the average Rhode Islander?
Right. So, like I said, about 144,000 people depend on SNAP. And what SNAP is, for people that do not know, is our supplemental nutrition assistance program to provide nutritional food for people who cannot afford it. In this bill, about 35,000 of those people are at risk of losing SNAP benefits. So what does that mean? And it's not just SNAP benefits. SNAP also help with free school lunches. It helps with farmer markets. It also help with some of our farmers and how they're able to supplement food for people. So what that means is families going hungry. And I think what's also important about this bill is the connection between programs. So you're losing your health insurance, possibly. You're losing SNAP, or you have to spend more money now for either, because they're cost sharing for patients, so you're spending more for healthcare, you're spending more for food. That means less money for rent. And so what is meaning on the ground is people are going hungry. Homelessness is going to be an issue, where before, under Medicaid, actually under SNAP, you had exemption if you didn't have a dependent, if you're homeless. You don't have that exemption, so homeless populations may not be able to have access to SNAP anymore. So that's what it means. Our Rhode Island neighbors are really going to be struggling even more than they have, because they don't have these safety nets anymore, or may not have it unless the state decides to step up.
And I guess my question is, where's the money going to come from? So it's one thing to sort of have this conversation about this. Okay, now this money has been cut, but there are still going to be people like you just described, our neighbors, who are now going to be unhoused, who are now going to not have medical care, who are now going to risk not having food to eat. What do our state leaders do to fill the gaps? Does that mean our taxes go up? Does that mean, and at the same time, and, we'll record this and a few weeks later it will air, we just heard the news about Hasbro. Right. So corporations are leaving. So who is going to make up the difference in Rhode Island?
That's a deep question. That's one of the reasons I signed the alarm in February to say, we need to do something to push back so this doesn't happen. Because once it happened, then we're in a very bad place. But I also did another op-ed in January saying it's happened, but there's still an opportunity to do something in Rhode Island. So what can we do? The bad news is 35.8% of our state budget comes from the federal government. So that's going to be dwindling a lot. We have deep cuts and deep shifts to Rhode Island. So how do we pay for it? Right now, I will say, though, we have a couple of things happening in Rhode Island that gives me some courage that we're doing something to address it. So there have state agencies have put together these federal advisory groups, and EPI is on a couple of them. We're on the one with the Department of Revenue and the Executive Office of Human and Health Services. So we're looking at which populations are impacted, how much it's going to cost the state. And at the end of October, there's going to be recommendations made to the governor and General Assembly on how to deal with this. From our perspective, right now, we're going to be facing, without any of this being touched in FY26, almost a $300 million budget deficit. So where are we going to get that money from?
That seems like a lot of money.
Yes. So one of the things we've been pushing is we have to raise revenue in the state of Rhode Island by taxing 1%. People are actually pushing back and say we need to think of taxing the top 10% because we need money. Last year, when we made a proposal for the top 1%, it was to raise about $190 million. That's not going to come close to our deficit or come close to dealing with the OBBB. And so raising revenue has to be a part of the solution, because we tend to, as a nation, as a state, when we are facing a budget issue, look at, can we cut the services to the most vulnerable populations? And we're against that, because at this time, it's like your first priority is to protect the most vulnerable amongst us. So how do we protect them? We have to raise revenue. And there may have to be tough decisions as far as cuts, but it shouldn't be starting with the most vulnerable population. So raise revenue has to be on the table, maybe some cuts and some adjustment with how we do work in Rhode Island. And then we need to think about how we invest in our economy. Hasbro left, a lot of people push back and saying doing a top 1% would drive corporations out of Rhode Island. Hasbro left Rhode Island to go to Massachusetts where there's a millionaire tax. Why? They cited public transportation as a big issue. We have decided to disinvest in our public transportation system, RIPTA, and so we need to think bigger about how do we invest in public transportation, in education, so that we can drive in those corporations that want the workers that are able to survive in Rhode Island.
So we had Senator Reid on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was concerned for the General Assembly that we were making this difficult, we're forcing them into a difficult choice. It's like, do you supply funds to education? Do you supply funds to healthcare? And how do you sort of split that baby?
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that other than just raising taxes? Is there how do we prioritize where we're going here?
Yeah, I think so. So a couple of things we have recommended, and because we spend a lot of our time diving into those issues, and we lead a lot of different coalitions. So we lead coalitions that are focused on childcare or senior assistance. And so we're able to get a big picture idea of where the needs are in Rhode Island. I think the General Assembly, again, we need money, right? That's like, we don't have enough money. We have to get more money. So I think it's bringing everyone to the table to say, every one of us have to play our role, including our wealthiest neighbors. Then the General Assembly have to look at how much are we spending on the different areas? So like I said, we're spending about $800 million on that expansion group, but that's an important group. That group also use those services for behavior and mental health. So we have to, policy, I always say, as one of the richest nations in the world, is a choice issue from my perspective. So the General Assembly have to make a choice. Are we going to let children go hungry? Are we going to make sure children are uneducated? Are we going to make sure people are healthy in Rhode Island? And then they have to list that and prioritize that, because that's where we will know which populations are the priority for Rhode Island and which programs are the priority for Rhode Island, and how to prioritizing certain programs help us as a state protect Rhode Islanders and help our economy grow.
I don't think I've had enough coffee yet today because I'm like 3 questions back, because I think the things you're saying are just so emotionally impactful. But the other thing that has been resonating as you've been talking is we need to decide who we are. Not who we say we are, but who we actually are. And we need that at a federal level, and we need that in Rhode Island. Because I think that, it's great. We're the state of Dell's Lemonade and calamari. Those things are wonderful, although I personally am allergic to calamari. We need to figure out what we stand for.
Exactly.
And how we are going to make strategic decisions to be who we say we are. And like, we worked through a similar process, almost a decade ago at the law school. And it was transformational for our law school. Now it feels like we need to do that at the state level. And I'm sure the state leaders are like not tuning into our podcast being like, oh, Nicole, what a great idea. I'm sure they're like working on all of that. But it just seems like we are at a moment where we need to be clear on who we are. We need to make the list. We need to decide who we are, and then we need to act, not in a political way, but in a very clear way on that list. Like, let's not say we're one thing and do another. Let's say and do what we want and work towards that. And so that has really struck me by your comments. Also, not everyone spends as much time on the budget as your organization does. Where can the average Rhode Islander go to find out about Rhode Island legislators, policymakers, information about your organization, and also the reports you put out and the work you're doing?
Yeah, so our website, and I can share a little bit about what we do because I haven't dived into it, but our website is www.economicprogressri.org. We have a resource library with all of our reports. We dive into the budget analysis and try to make it condense our budget, because sometimes it's over 200 pages, so no one's reading that either except for Alan and maybe Nicole and a few people on my team. But you can go to our website and look at the reports. You can go to our website, look up past trainings we've done to break these issues down for you. And I can share a little bit about what we do now or whenever you're ready.
And we'll add all of that to the show notes as well. So if you're looking for more information on the Economic Progress Institute, you can find that in the show notes. But
I'd love to hear about what you do and who you are. And in particular, Me and some of my colleagues are working on the coalition about equity impact statements.
Yes.
So can you talk about what you do and then also talk a little bit about what equity impact statements are?
For sure. And though your point about deciding who we are in this moment is for all of us, right? And it's very challenging. I think we have to acknowledge that because funding is being used, states are running scared because they don't want to lose funding. Nonprofits are running scared. Higher education is running scared, right? And so knowing who you are in this moment to say we're assessing our level of risk and still deciding to stand on who we are is really important. And that is what Economic Progress Institute, we had to do as well. We are a policy and research organization. We're committed to racial and economic justice, whether it's 2025 or 2028, right? And making sure we're committed to that in a moment where saying the word race or equity are risky, making that decision to stand on that has been really important for us. So what is the Economic Progress Institute? We're policy and research. We are a watchdog organization. What does that mean? We hold leaders accountable to do right by their people. We are a think tank. We do data analysis to say what are in these type of bills, who it's going to be impacting, how much it's going to cost us. But then we're also an action tank. And I love that about our organization. We provide the data and then we show up to advocate for what is right for the people. And then the other part I really like is we're a coalition builder. We convene people around the table because one organization cannot have all of the insights. And we want to make sure communities are at the table because they have deeper insights about how policies impact them. So we convene a lot of different coalitions, including like revenue for Rhode Islanders, including the Pay Leave Coalition I just passed some pay leave expansions, childcare issues, our Rhode Island works that provide cash assistance under the safety net, and the Equity Impact Campaign is one of those coalitions we lead. And why did we decide to do the Equity Impact Campaign? For movements like these. Equity Impact Campaign has been pushing equity impact statements for years in legislation. Because if we don't think about who policies are going to impact, we make bad bills like this big ugly bill. And we need to think about who's going to be impacted, how much it's going to cost the state. So equity impact statement is those tools legislators can use to pause, to say, hold up, if we don't raise taxes, who's being impacted by that? People are going to be cut on Medicaid if we don't raise taxes and SNAP. So that's a tool to pause before you make policy to say, who will be impacted by this? And is that who we are by standing back and not doing something to address that?
I was in a conversation yesterday with former guest and colleague, Susie Harrington-Steppen, about the value of slowness as an attorney. And I think this applies to like sort of the value of slowness as a legislator. Like you have an 870-page bill, you got to go. But there's also this moment where you can stop and read a statement about who this is going to impact. And again, and figure out who you are. Who are you as an elected official? Who are you as someone who has the ability to protect the people who need protection the most? And so do other states have these equity statements?
They do. So Colorado, and I'll use name a few. Colorado, Virginia, Maine have these. So these are some of the ones who started. Iowa was one of the few states that started these. And it started in criminal justice, right? Because when we look at the data, Black men, for example, were in prisons more than any. So it's like, why is that? Do we have policies that are making this happen? So they started doing these equity impact statement to really do an assessment of why do we have X number of people in certain things? Or why do we have, maternity rate? Why are Black women, more at risk of, mortality when they have their babies versus others? So that is what it does. It's an assessment of we're doing this thing, but we have these historically excluded group, historically disenfranchised groups, and they are that way because we have implemented policies that made it that way. So how do we change the ties to make sure we're not continuing to do that?
So it's sort of like at the end of the bill, at the beginning of the bill, and it says like, this is a bill that's neutral on its face, but here are the people that this could impact. This decision to cut money, this decision to add money, here are the potential people who are underserved, underrepresented, historically excluded that this might impact. Is that
correct? Yeah, and we also, and this is like you're hearing this first on, Law 401. We're creating
Breaking news.
We're creating equity scorecards so legislators and even any one of us who are doing work in the community can score ourselves. So be like, how many groups have been impacted by this in the past? And then that score can lead to creating the statement. So do like, we did a mini assessment of this, and these are the groups we know will be positively impacted by this bill or negatively impacted by this bill.
So I'm just going to say this has been a really heavy episode in some ways as we talk about the real life impact on real people here in the state. So I'd like to leave our guests, our audience with some hope, right? The state motto, hope. What gives you hope, Weayonnoh, that this state can actually rise to the challenges that all of this time is creating for them?
So who I am is a believer in democracy. I believe in democracy. I believe in the people will to stand up and protect democracy, because just as I've witnessed democracy crumble, I've witnessed people stand up to fight for democracy. And I remember at the end of last year when I knew what 2025 was going to be, I went to one of my favorite quotes by Fred Roger. And it goes something like, when I look in the news and see bad things, my mom would say to me, look to the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. So that's what gives me hope. I look to my partners, to advocates, to immigrants who are resilient in the midst of this. So nonprofits who are standing in the gap for government and saying we will help communities who need it. That is what's giving me hope in this movement. Those who are not giving up on each other.
You didn't ask me, but I have an answer. Can I give it?
Yes.
I feel like similar to you, have just a genuine core belief, and my belief is in like radical empathy and love. And I think like so many things, and it sounds so cheesy. I'm not a cheesy person. Mm-hmm. I have some difficult edges at times. That's a nice way of saying it.
Thank you for acknowledging that.
I just believe like if we can slow down and think about who things are affecting and empathize with them and believe in love and empathy, that we can find our way out of any difficult situation, but we need to do it together. And so no matter what's going on, if we just keep working, I believe that is going to matter.
So we have a tradition of always ending on a fun question. And so I'm just going to ask, knowing the both of you as well as I do, that we not delve into the Real Housewives of Rhode Island here. But Nicole, do you have the question for our guest?
So I read online that your hero is Nelson Mandela. To prepare for this, I watched like every video of you ever being interviewed.
Oh my.
And if you had to name a local Rhode Island hero, who would it be and why?
So I'll have to take a different take to this question because, and back to my answer to the previous question, we're hosting our budget and policy conference on September 29th. And this year, when we talked about who to honor, I was like, we need to honor the people. Because I went back to the Constitution and think of democracy, we the people. Because I keep going back to that. It's like we the people can save our democracy. So right now, my heroes are those people in Rhode Island who are still resilient, who are fighting, who are standing up and pushing back because they believe in what is possible. So those are my heroes. And we'll be honoring all of our heroes. If you're fighting for democracy, if you're standing 10 toes down, if you are being attacked, yet you are standing up for yourself, we the people are my hero for this year.
What about you, Nicole?
Oh, I mean, my answer's not as good as that, but my answer right now, and I'm having my like meeting the moment year. Like, who are the people who are meeting the moment? My answer is Steve Ahlquist. I feel like I desperately care about people having access to information, and Steve Ahlquist, who goes around and takes videos of things that are happening and public meetings, and he is making law and lawmaking more accessible to all Rhode Islanders, and he's my hero, my Rhode Island hero, because of that.
That's a good one.
That's a good one.
What about you?
Mine is Arlene Violet.
Another good one.
Arlene is just badass. I don't know if I can say that on the podcast, but I guess I'm a host and I can. First woman of woman attorney general in the United States, a former nun who took on the mafia here in the state of Rhode Island, and just an incredibly kind person. She's been deeply involved in the university and the law school, and she's someone I've gotten to know and deeply, deeply respect. And her empathy is just incredible. So that's mine.
Nice. And maybe one day we'll get her on as a guest.
I'd love to have Arlene on as a guest.
So Weayonnoh Nelson-Davies, thank you for joining us and helping us think about Rhode Island's future after the One Big Beautiful Bill. We're going to try to share the links to information about your organization, the Boston Globe op-ed.
Yes.
And anything else we talked about in our show notes. This is to you and all of your colleagues and to everyone out there. We need to get better at doing this. You need to subscribe to our podcast
on Spotify and Apple.
You need to like, subscribe, listen to, share with your friends, and review on Spotify and Apple. And one of the things that I like is people just sharing it with their friends. People just saying, hey, I heard this podcast on this thing, check it out. And I think that is really the way to share information. And so please do that. Thank you so much for coming on. And do you want to have a final word?
Yeah, no, if you have episode ideas or guests, our email is law401podcast@rwu.edu. We would love to hear from our audience. And honestly, help us spread the word and get this out to more Rhode Islanders. We've heard from so many people so far, but we want to hear from more of you. So I'm Michael Donnelly Boylan. This is my co-host, Nicole Dyslevsky. Thank you again for listening to the Law 401 podcast, Legal Issues Decoded. We will see you back here next Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in to Law 401, Legal Issues Decoded from Roger Williams University School of Law. We'd like to thank our guests on the show today. The Law 401 podcast wouldn't be possible without the generous funding from the Hassenfeld Family Foundation. We'd also like to thank executive producer from RWU Law, Helga Melgar, the RWU Marketing and Communications team, podcast social media manager, Ali Michelle Conti, and our production partner, Focus Forward Media. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Roger Williams University or our partners. For more Law 401 episodes and updates, follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts on YouTube or visit law.rwu.edu.